You are tuned into the Power Chord Hour right here on 107.9 WRFA, as well as the Power Chord Hour podcast. However, you are listening to this or watching this on YouTube, thanks for checking it out. Very excited. I know I've been gone for a while, but we're back with quite a strong one. Very happy to be talking to Justin Perkins on today's episode, owner of Mystery Room Mastering. One of the big things we're going to be talking about, he did the mastering on the upcoming Replacements release, Tim, the Let It Bleed edition, out September 22nd on Rhino Records. In addition to that, I mean, Justin has done mastering work on all the, if you're a Replacements fan, the re-releases the last couple of years. Pleased to Meet Me, Don't Tell a Soul, Sorry Ma, all those good ones. He's done work on those. Lots of good stuff to get into. So that is what we're going to do. Justin, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing good. I really, like I was telling you, I'm excited to have you on. I mean, obviously I'm a huge Replacements fan, so fun to talk about that. But I mean, I'm a fan of your music and what you do mastering and all of that. So happy to just kind of talk about it all with you. So, I mean, I guess let's start off with Mystery Room Mastering. I mean, how long has that been up and running now? I know that, I mean, you run that. You are, as far as I know, you are basically Mystery Room Mastering. I mean, how long has that kind of existed now? How long have you been running that?
Yeah, it's kind of a dumb name. I didn't expect it to be such a long-lasting studio when I thought of it, but I had been recording and mixing bands for over a decade, starting going back to being in high school and even middle school.
Wow.
And as we got close, I think 2009 is when I officially opened the mastering studio. I had left Smart Studios in Madison doing recording and mixing and moved to Milwaukee and did a little freelancing here and there, but an existing mastering studio fell in my lap. It was already built out. I had to provide the equipment and all that stuff, but this previous mastering engineer was moving to the East Coast and said, "Do you want to rent my room?" He owned the building and said, "Do you want to rent my space? Because I know you're kind of getting into mastering." So 2009 is when I officially registered the business officially with the government and all that stuff, and started calling it that, and started making the intentional transition into mastering specifically. Instead of being a jack of all trades, I said, I'm going to focus on just mastering. And it took a number of years, a couple of years to, I was still mixing some of my favorite bands and stuff I couldn't say no to. But for the most part, I was trying to do only mastering. And after a few years, I would say I was, 80% mastering, and now I'm 110% mastering. So 2009 basically is when that shift occurred.
Wow, I guess I didn't realize you'd been at least, I mean, I guess I know how long you've been mastering, but I didn't realize Mystery Room had been around so long. As far as like mastering goes, how long have you been doing mastering work? Obviously, you were doing it before this. I mean, when did you kind of start doing mastering?
Well, the thing is, for those that don't know what mastering is, the last person that touched it mastered it. So I was doing a lot of low budget local bands, out of high school and early 2000s. And some of them didn't have the budget for proper mastering. And also logistics were a factor. This is before the internet was capable of sending a whole album through the internet in high resolution. This is back in the Napster era where you were lucky to download the worst sounding MP3s. So that took half a day. So a lot of bands I was working with up in like Green Bay, Wisconsin, they didn't have the budget for mastering. So I would be the default mastering engineer. And I didn't necessarily know all that it entailed, but I had some mastering software that helped me finish the records. And then as my projects got better, I got good at convincing people into using a proper mastering engineer. But in the 2000s, I was kind of learning the basics of mastering and getting some practice repetitions in of mastering albums and seeing how that worked out. And then towards the end of the 2000s, people were asking me to just master their album, and that's sort of what pushed me into even considering starting a dedicated mastering studio, is starting to get those emails and calls about just mastering albums. Because my experience with mastering was recording and mixing an album and then having to also do the mastering, the quasi mastering as best as I could. And once I started to focus on mastering specifically, I realized how much more involved it is than I used to think it was, when I was handling the mixing and recording. There's a whole other layer of detail that you can focus on as a mastering engineer when that's all you do.
No, that makes sense. I mean, mastering, it is like you mentioned. I don't think a lot of people do truly like. I feel like I kind of know what mastering is, but if you put me on the spot to try to like explain it to someone, yeah, it's not as I feel like cut and dry as like engineering or doing production and stuff. Which also like with that, I mean, the behind the scenes things side of music. I mean, recording, producing, engineering, that kind of stuff. Were you always? I'm assuming with stuff like that. I mean, were you always dabbling in that even with your own music, or did that come later on? Because I'm assuming you probably started playing music and somewhere in there later on you start kind of the engineering, the production, the recording, or you're always kind of dabbling in that.
Well, early on, I had to learn it out of necessity. We were in seventh, eighth grade, and we couldn't really get to a recording studio. We didn't have driver's licenses, and back then studios were busy and didn't necessarily take eighth graders seriously. If they want to book time, we probably didn't have enough money for studio time. So out of necessity, I learned how to record us on a cassette 8-track, a Tascam Porta Studio. With so this would be like mid 90s. So I never wanted to be a recording engineer, but out of necessity, I became the person that paid the most attention to how it operates when the guy dropped it off that we rented it from at our house, our parents' base, our drummer's basement, basically. It's where we would practice and ended up recording some basic stuff. And that's when other bands started to hear it, what I was doing for our band, and ask me to record them. And I never set out to be an engineer or mix engineer. It just sort of happened by accident. And so I was doing it early on. And then after high school, I had a couple odd jobs, but ended up working at a pretty great studio in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I don't know if you know the band Boris the Sprinkler.
Oh yeah, I love
Yeah.
Boris Sprinkler.
Yeah. That's where they did all their albums in the 90s. It was called Simple Studios. And the guy was just very good. I mean, at the time, he had the studio was in his basement too. By the time I started working there, he had moved it to a bigger warehouse, which was cool because it had a huge room for doing drums, so you could get these big drum sounds with room mics. But he just did great recordings, and he taught me a lot about recording and how to get things to sound a certain way when I got out of high school and started working at his studio.
Now, I guess, I mean, and we get into this like with the timeline and kind of your career and everything, but like, I mean, on top of doing like mastering, production, all that, I mean, you were in a couple bands. I mean, I play the Obsoletes on the radio show, love the Obsoletes. Know you're in Yesterday's Kids, bands like that. Like in this timeline, are you kind of like are they kind of going at the same time? Like, are you working in studios and doing that while, I mean, like with the Obsoletes and stuff, or are they kind of going at the same time? Are you doing production for a while, then you get into the band, then you get back into it? Like, does all this kind of exist around the same time? Or, I know it's a long timeline, but I guess I'm trying to like put what you're doing all together.
Yeah, it kind of went hand in hand. The first Yesterday's Kids release, I didn't record that. I recorded the demos, but I knew that if we were gonna even consider releasing it, we had to go to Simple Studios. So we did our first EP in like 2001 at Simple Studios. It was meant to just be demos, but Ben from Screeching Weasel heard it and decided to just release it as is. We got rid of a couple songs, but it was really meant to just be demos. We did them pretty fast at Simple Studios. And like I said, I knew that it would be better to go to a real studio and do that instead of me trying to do it. And I was pretty hands off. I was just played, I was just a musician for that session. Basically, I didn't have a lot of input on the engineering side of it. By the time we did the second Yesterday's Kids release, which came out on Panic Button Records, but we were basically working with Lookout Records at that point. They were running Panic Button. So Lookout gave us a good budget, and Simple Studios had just moved. So we had this huge space to work with, and we took our time. The owner of Simple Studios engineered the basic tracks, and then myself and Tim from Yesterday's Kids, we took many weeks just experimenting with adding stuff, probably a little too much stuff, but we explored a lot. And then Eric from Simple Studios mixed it. But at that time, I was doing a lot of recording for other bands, which is perhaps part of why we didn't do much touring, because I was more busy in the studio and kind of got a sense that it was easier to make a living being an engineer than in a band. And Yesterday's Kids broke up not too long after the second record. And the Obsoletes was really just me recording demos at Simple Studios between other sessions to a drum
Oh,
machine. Yeah. Because it was up in, it was about an hour away from where I lived. The studio didn't have internet, which at the time wasn't a weird thing. It was, 2003. It was in a warehouse. It was kind of a DIY punk studio. I used to have to go to the library to check my email like once a day and stuff like that when I would stay. So I would stay overnight there a lot because I didn't want to drive home for an hour just to drive back for an hour. So there's a shower there and everything. And I would just, after sometimes like when sessions would get done early enough, I would maybe record a song to a drum machine. And a mutual friend introduced me to John Phillip, who was the Obsoletes drummer. His band, the Benjamins, had just broken up or stopped playing. And, she said, you guys like similar music, you should meet and whatever. So I had him come up and play drums to some of these demos that I had been working on to a drum machine. And he was such a good drummer. Yesterday's Kids drummer kind of struggled to play to a metronome, and that's a controversial topic of using a metronome or click track. But the fact that these songs were recorded to a drum machine and John could play to a metronome meant that he could add real drums to these demos that I did to a drum machine, and they turned out cool, I guess. And he was really pushing to play live shows, so he said we should start a band, and that's how the Obsoletes came about. And we started out as a 5-piece band with the whole, like I played acoustic guitar and sang, and we had a organ player and all this, but it basically regressed back to a 3-piece like Yesterday's Kids was. I played bass. I moved over to bass, Tim Schweiger on guitar and John on drums, just because it was easier, I think, to play shows. And I was almost going to say easier to rehearse, but it was actually easier to not rehearse because with 3 people, there's less to go wrong. So we could kind of just wing it a little more live and not have to figure so much stuff out at rehearsals and stuff.
Kind of with that, because that's interesting. Like, I love the Obsoletes, and I think I told you that. I mean, I discovered you guys in like 2017, 2018, long after you were broken up. So like, I had no clue you were ever a 5-piece or anything like that. I mean, for people who don't know, I mean, you had the band put out one record. I mean, when you were that 5-piece, were those sessions? Did it ever, when you were getting that record around, were you writing and recording still as a 5-piece at that point, or by the time it was time to do that record, it was a 3-piece and you were writing as a 3-piece?
Yeah, by the time we did the album, it was a 3-piece. I played bass on the album. I might have played some acoustic and extra guitar parts, but we were basically back to a 3-piece. I mean, the problem is the demos I did, I was just screwing around. I had a pedal steel player come in, I had an organ player, dobro. I was just kind of like goofing around, trying to understand how to record other types of music besides pop punk, basically. Like what other stuff can we add and how can it sound? So I was kind of just experimenting around, and that's how the band started. And then we did, for the Obsoletes record, we did have some auxiliary players come in and do some organ and a little bit of pedal steel and stuff. But I think we kind of made it so we could still play live as a 3-piece, and it worked, because we could still do all the harmonies, and the nuts and bolts were there. But the album was based, I remember playing bass on the album for sure. So we just did it as a 3-piece and added some of what I had done on the demos, but not everything. And we did that on tape because at the time I was the studio I worked at had a PC and I didn't have any control. I wasn't a big computer guy back then. I am now, but the guy had a Windows PC to record on, and I was just getting tired of it being a pain. It was constantly had issues. So I'm like, I want to make a record on tape. I know tape's harder, but it's not going to crash on us and all this stuff. So we did it on like a 1-inch 24-track tape machine, which was fine. It was actually a harder album to mix because we didn't have any automation on the mixing console. Like nowadays in Pro Tools, you could mix Bohemian Rhapsody in Pro Tools as one person because you just draw it all in. And but back then we needed like 2 or 3 people there to mix the songs, turn faders up and down as the song played. You know, there was no automation because we did it all on tape. So um, that had pros and cons to it, but it got done, and it is what it is.
How long did that record take to record? Like how long was that
You
the
know,
sessions for?
probably on and off for a couple months, really. You know, it helped that I worked at the studio because I got free or reduced recording time, and I engineered it, a lot of it. So we did have another friend engineer the basic track, so I could play bass out in the live room and not have to be using, be multitasking and stuff like that. But
This stuff it's very interesting to me because I mean I'm a fan of the band, but like really know none of the backstory. I know the players. I don't know much besides that. So it's all kind of interesting. I was also like wondering with the Obsoletes, like did you? I know you said like with Yesterday's Kids, you didn't really get to tour a lot. What about with the Obsoletes? I mean, did the band? Did you tour? Did you play out a lot, or was it mostly kind of around like the Wisconsin area?
it was mostly regional. I mean, we started out great. Our first like run of shows was with Super Drag.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
yeah, I think it was like maybe 3 shows with Super Drag. That's how we started out. You know, we had no album out or nothing. We're just like, hey, we're a new band, and we got to open for Super Drag. It was great. We mostly did regional stuff. I don't know if you know Ben Pearlstein, but
Yeah.
he was just starting to work for a management company in Minneapolis that was managing like Soul Asylum. It might have just been their booking agent actually, but either way, Ben was involved with a lot of live stuff for bands like Soul Asylum, and he was using some of those resources to book us, and it didn't really go too far. Um, we did like one tour. It was not very good for the most part. A couple good shows here and there, but we mostly just played around the Midwest, and that was some of those shows were really fun. The touring, we had just had no business touring at that point. We just had nothing really to promote, and no one, the shows were fairly sparsely attended for the most part.
How about like with the band? I mean, I guess too, like thinking of the timeline, like where did the Obsoletes exist, I guess? Because like I'm trying to think that record came out like '03 around, right? That was like '03.
Yeah, 2003 or 4. John, our drummer John and Ben, they had really strong Milwaukee connections to a lot of the venues. So it's very easy for us to play at some of the better small and mid-sized clubs in Milwaukee. And we actually did very well. We could fill up most of the mid-sized clubs, either headlining or co-headlining, and
Wow.
the venues would be packed, and people would make come home with a little bit of money, and it was fun. So we did that for like quite at least a handful of years, but we never got around to making a second record. We recorded some demos that we still could release at some point as maybe not an official record, but just to get them out there. We did them at a studio in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, that I could just never get to sound great. I don't know what the problem was with that studio, but the songs are there for people that want to hear them. It's okay, but it's not a finished record or anything. It's just some better than maybe above average demos and stuff like that. So we never really did our second record. We kind of fizzled out. John started playing with this band called Limbeck, who are a very busy touring band. They had somehow needed a drummer, and John really liked Limbeck and knew all their songs, so he jumped in with Limbeck. I was just getting busier recording bands and ended up moving to Madison to work at Smart Studios. So the band just sort of took a back seat around 2008 or so, maybe 2006 or 7, really.
Roughly like a 5-year run then for the Obsoletes, somewhere kind of in there, maybe around 5 years.
Yeah, I'd say 4 to 5 years. We could have done another record and kind of repeated everything, but I don't know. I never really enjoyed touring very much, at least the way we were touring at the time, and ended up sticking in the studio. I mean, the ironic part is I ended up joining Screeching Weasel, and we did not a lot of touring, but a lot of shows. But at that point, you're flying out, you're staying in hotels
Oh yeah, you're not band
easily.
touring.
Yeah, I mean, I'm allergic to cats, and like I swear, anyone that's gonna let you stay at their house on tour has at least one cat. Um, and we weren't really at a level where we could do hotels and stuff. Um, so yeah, we just kind of fizzled out. And John did Limbeck, Tim did some other stuff, and Tim and John ended up playing with Tommy Stinson. And, he started doing some live stuff, but since Tommy plays bass, I wasn't really needed for that situation until a little bit later. But basically, I just kind of went it, and that's about the time I started Mystery Room Mastering, is 2009. Now I'm like realizing that this could be a career instead of just a hobby or something I do to get by. It's actually starting to turn into an actual job.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. Like including kind of with that timeline, then like you were saying later on, and we'll get into that. I mean, you playing with Tommy and everything, but like so was there any pull of that? Because you're talking about like it's becoming more of I can do I can do the mystery room mastering, I can do this for a living. But I mean, is there still that like offers to go play or go play with bands and do stuff? I mean, is there a little of you have to think this out, or is it just like, no, I really don't want to play with bands. I just want to kind of do more of the behind the scenes stuff. Or is there any conflict with that?
It would have to be a pretty big offer. I mean, not to get too far ahead, but when I wanted to play with Tommy Stinson because I like his songs, and he's a lot
Yeah, no
of
one's going to blame you for that. To want
he's
to
a
play
lot
with
he's a
Spencer.
really really great guy and easy to work with and very totally cool with everything. But it got to the point where the tour the long weekends here and there turned into like 2 and 3 week tours, and I'm like, I just can't leave my studio for that long. And when I was at that point, I was married too, so there's family life involved with all that too. In 2008, I was not married, but my point is, I just kind of knew that it was going to have to be one or the other. It was too hard to be playing a lot of live music and then have a studio at the same time, or have any kind of business to run at home where you just need to be there. Because I don't know, especially with mastering, but even in mixing, if you're known as the person that's only around sometimes, and someone wants to make a record, you're probably not going to get that call because they're just going to assume you're on tour or too busy and stuff like that. So I don't know if it was conscious or not, but I basically just stopped playing live. But it's the same thing with Screeching Weasel. Ben from Screeching Weasel was like, "Hey, I'm going to do some solo shows. Do you want to play bass?" And I was like, "Okay, those will probably be pretty good shows." And I already kind of had the songs ingrained in my head from listening to them in high school. So it was easy. And then, sure enough, that turned into long weekends. We never did any touring because Ben also doesn't really like touring. Um, that ended. There's a whole other story why that ended. But basically, it'd have to be a pretty big offer at this point for me to go play live again. If it was a one-off or a long weekend, I would do it. It'd be very hard for me to join a active band that's doing 2 and 3 week tours um, fairly often, because I'm already backed up a lot as it is. I can't afford to, not financially, but time wise, I can't really afford to um, be less productive in the studio. Than things just back up really quickly with mastering.
No, that makes sense. I mean, you've gotten to the point now. I mean, looking at the titles and stuff you've done, it's like go to a van tour and like sleep on someone's floor or something like that versus, mastering. Yeah, no, I think at this point you can do a whole lot more with the mastering and kind of that side of things. I don't think I can blame you for not wanting to go out there and road dog it or anything like that.
Yeah, and with Tommy, we traveled comfortably. I did like a week-long tour with Paul Collins somewhere in there too, like 2012, 13, and he's a little bit more of a DIYer. We slept on a lot of people's floors on that little week-long tour, a couple hotels, but that was sort of the eye opener. Like, man, I'm not cut out for this anymore. I'm not 19 years old anymore.
So let's
Uh,
let's uh let's get into that with playing with Tommy and everything. I mean, when later on did you kind of get into that fold, like you were talking about Johnny and everything, kind of getting into there? When do you kind of get into the mix? When do you start playing with him? All of that.
it's funny. I actually had to look it up because I thought it might come up. It looks like it was November of 2012.
Oh
Could be
wow.
2011, depending. I think it was 2012 though. basically John and Tim were playing with Tommy a little bit already. He was on bass, John was on drums, Tim was on guitar. They were doing some stuff. I think they did South by Southwest, because I think he had one of his solo records coming out at the time. He was doing shows, but basically, and kind of what I realized with the Obsoletes is it's a lot more fun or easier or traditional or whatever to play guitar and sing lead vocals. Playing bass and singing lead vocals is doable. You know, we all know Thin Lizzy and Motorhead and stuff, but it's just not as natural. So at some point, you know, Tommy really wanted to play guitar and sing his songs, so he needed a bass player. And yeah, I think it was fall of 2012 or 11. Guns N' Roses was touring and playing Chicago, and he wanted to do an in-store at Reckless Records in Chicago for his new record. It might have been One Man Mutiny, or I guess you could look it up online.
It came out around that time. I would say that era probably.
Yeah.
Is One Mutiny.
So he's doing these in-stores, you know, on the Guns N' Roses tour. He would just find a record store and do in-stores, and they were usually acoustic, or his wife at the time might sing backing vocals. But being in Chicago, I actually don't know if John was in Nashville yet at that point, but me and Tim were in Milwaukee. I just drove down, and we did an in-store at Reckless Records, and I had never met him, and we had never rehearsed. I met him like in the street, and then 20 minutes later, we're playing a mini set at Reckless Records, and I wasn't really nervous because I had played with Tim and John so much already. You know, it was kind of like pretty comfortable. And with Paul Collins, you know, I learned Paul's songs and met him at Soundcheck, and that night we're playing a show. So I was kind of getting used to just learning songs and winging it, you know. So anyways, we did a in-store at Reckless, you know, that evening before a Guns N' Roses show. And then maybe a year or two later, he hired the Obsoletes to be his backing band for an East Coast run. It was pretty short. It was like a week maybe. But it was a lot of fun to do that. You know, we met at his house and did a day or two of rehearsal, and you know, he was really excited. Like, he was just running around the house, you know, looking for this particular chord to hook up his PA for the vocal. You know, just it reminded me of being in high school, like trying to get a vocal PA set up for band practice. You know, just nothing fancy, but you know, he's just really excited, and yeah, you know, about having a band to go do some shows with, especially low key. I mean, he was kind of at the tail end of Guns N' Roses world, which is a whole different thing. So to just kind of get in a little van and, you know, not necessarily wing it, but do it pretty low key, I think was exciting and interesting to him. And so we did that week, and then things just kind of fizzled out. I don't even know what happened exactly, to be honest with you. But he started playing with other people, Frank from Guns N' Roses and Cat Popper, Luther Dickinson. He had a couple different live bands evolving slowly. And but what happened was, like 2015, 2016, he was supposed to play a Midwest run, and Ben, his manager, asked if I would do live sound. And I hate doing live sound, but I have done live sound for bands like the Promise Ring, who are from Milwaukee.
Oh, nice.
They did some reunion shows, and I don't even consider myself a live sound person, but when you play nice enough venues, you can kind of lean on the house venue live sound person to like get it up and running. And I'm basically there to mix the show. You know, I know how the songs should sound. I know when this person does a solo or that person sings backing vocals, and I know not to put a ton of Pink Floyd delay on the lead vocals, because some sound guys get a little carried away, or sound persons. Anyway, so I'm like, okay, I'll do sound for your week of shows in the Midwest. It could be fun. It's January. And Cat Popper, who was supposed to play bass, had some sort of health thing come up, and she couldn't do the tour. So it became, actually, instead of doing sound, can you play bass? Because it's a little more important to have a bass player than a sound person. So I learned up the most recent songs, and you know, did bass for that tour. And that was kind of the very beginning of the reformation of Bash and Pop. We did a handful. I don't even know how many shows we did, but we did a decent amount of shows as Tommy Stinson, and at one point we were playing in Canada and decided to just call it Bash and Pop from there on out, because Tommy was working on what became the next Bash and Pop record. What's it called? Anything Can Happen. Anything Could Happen. And he just kept getting comments that those songs sounded like the first Bash and Pop record. And he wasn't it didn't start out as a Bash and Pop record, but
Oh, really?
he kept getting that feedback of, hey, this group of new songs you have sounds like Bash and Pop. And he just happened to have, a rock band again, me and Steve Salvage and Joe. So yeah, it just became Bash and Pop from there on out, and the records started coming together. He was most of it was basically all recorded at his house in why am I blanking on where, in Hudson. So it just kind of all came together naturally, and all of a sudden it's Bash and Pop, and there's a new record, and I'm still playing bass. I actually didn't play bass on the Bash and Pop record.
Oh, you
I could
didn't?
Nope. I could have flown out for a weekend or so of sessions, but I'm like, Tommy's a pretty good bass player. I think he can handle it. I mixed the Bash and Pop record, and I played a lot of like acoustic guitar and tambourine and backing vocals, because the way that started was he had like 2 songs done. What was it called? Not This Time, and one other one came out as a 7-inch. And I was not. This is at the point in time where I'm just mastering, but Ben Perlstein was like, "Hey, Tommy's got 2 songs that he wants to put on a 7-inch. Can you mix them?" And I'm like, "Man, I'm really not mixing anymore. I don't really like mixing. It's a pain, but okay, I'll do it." So I did these 2 songs, and Ben was like, "If you hear any backing vocals or something, just add it." So I did a couple harmonies, and Tommy liked it, and that was the beginning of the next record. Uh, so I did a lot of like bells and whistles and stuff on that record, but I didn't play bass on it because some of it was already done before I was involved, and then the rest of it, he played bass on because he did it at his house. There was no point in me flying out there to play bass, when he could do it. So
Did you have any like saying like the sequencing or any of those those behind the scenes
uh,
parts too? Because it doesn't sound like you had like a producer per se, right? There wasn't like a producer involved so much.
no, I mean, Tommy basically recorded it all at his house. A lot of it pretty live, to be honest. Cat Popper played on a lot of it. And even the tracks that he played bass on, they probably just recorded them without bass, like guitar, kind of jammed it out without a bass player. And then he just added the bass later. So no, I wouldn't say I produced it. I would say I mixed it and did a little bit of editing. Sometimes he would send me a handful of vocal takes, and it's like, okay, which take do we use? A little bit of vocal comping, as they call it, where you get a handful of takes and you decide, okay, this line on this take is the best one, and this line on that take is the best one, and kind of put it together. Things like that. I wouldn't say that I produced it though. The thing is like the first Bash and Pop record was done in a world-class studio with a major label type budget, and that record was done in Tommy's house in like a dining room with no acoustic treatment and a lot of bleed and really nobody producing. It was kind of just produced by whatever was going on. It was kind of he wanted it to be a fun, plug it in and do it how the Replacements used to do it. Don't overthink it, just plug in and go. So it wasn't really picked over and thought out as much as like the first Bash and Pop record. And I just love on the first Bash and Pop album, I love the drum room sounds that they got on that record. I mean, not to get too nerdy, but the drums just sound amazing on that record because
Really
they
do.
did it in a big room, and they could put microphones across the room, and you're just not going to get that kind of sound in a house, in a dining room kind of situation. So it's very apples and oranges. So it was what it was, but yeah, that record did okay. So then we started with the 2 and 3 week tours, and I did a few of them, but I'm like, I just can't keep doing this because I got stuff going on at home, and I was just thinking long term. Like, so someone else took my place for a little while in Bash and Pop. on bass, and then that kind of fizzled out. And then Tommy transitioned into what he's doing now, which is Cowboys in the Campfire. I don't know if you've heard that record, but
Oh yeah.
it's basically him and Chip. They were doing these duo shows. Tommy would play acoustic, Chip would play electric and lap steel and stuff. And that's just a more economical touring vehicle for this day and age, even before the pandemic. You know, with how poorly streaming is paying out, and the other thing with that 7-inch I mixed for Tommy, I was going to say that was back when you could get 7 inches made in like a month or two. Now it takes a long time to get vinyl made. But I just did those initial 2 songs as a quick, mix them quick so we can put out a 7-inch for this upcoming tour kind of thing. But the record came out on Fat Possum Records, and they did as much of a push as they could as far as publicity and PR stuff and doing the Colbert Show and stuff like that. But there were, they got a really good offer to open for the Psychedelic Furs, which would have been a really kind of gravy tour because it was nice theaters, opening set. So, 30 to 40 minutes tops and you're done. In theory, I would have loved to do that tour, but I was coming off of a number of 2 or 3 week tours, which for the other guys in the band, that's all they kind of do is they're built for touring. Steve's in the Hold Steady. They're touring at one point, at least we're touring Machine. Joe was in Mighty Mighty Boss Town. They're just so used to touring and being on the road. Whereas for me, that's not what I'm used to. And I could only handle so much touring before I had to make a decision.
No, it's kind of funny. I saw Bash and Pop. I want to say it was either the first show without you or the second show without you in Pittsburgh. Because I thought you were playing, and then I got there and it was someone else. But was that the last time then? Because that was like 2017. Was that like the last time you really did any touring or really? Because like that did seem. I mean, I love that Bash and Pop record. I was following the band and everything during that time. You were busy. I mean, he did. I feel like you toured a lot. The band toured a lot in 2017 and did a lot. Like, was that the last time you really did shows and played out and all that? Was that the last time, or
Yeah.
since have you?
Yeah, my last show, it was actually in London at Hyde Park. We
Oh
played
wow!
we played a big festival with Green Day and the Hives and Rancid, I think, and it was a lot of fun. But I haven't touched my bass since then, since I flew home. And I remember I wanted to get home to see Tom Petty play at Summerfest here in Milwaukee, and I did, and that ended up being Tom's last tour. So I'm glad I got to see him do one last Summerfest show in Milwaukee. But yeah, that's when I realized I'm not cut out for playing live music anymore. And now I have a bit of a mobile mastering rig where if I had to travel, I could kind of pull it off, but I don't really want to go back down that path unless it'd have to be a pretty big offer that I couldn't refuse. And not to say that Tommy isn't a big offer and I don't love his music and I like working with him a lot, but he had someone that he had played with. The person that replaced me had played bass with him like previously, maybe in the late 2000s or probably in the late 2000s or mid 2000s. So it wasn't, I knew that I wanted to make sure that someone could take over that was familiar. I didn't want to leave him hanging, but I just had to make a decision of what I was going to do because I just couldn't do those long back-to-back tours anymore.
Now, kind of going off that. I mean, obviously, quite a big Tommy Stinson connection there. I mean, is the Tommy Stinson connection? I mean, is that kind of how? Because again, you've been doing tons of work the last few years on all these replacements re-releases. I mean, is that kind of how that came about through Tommy?
Yeah, indirectly. It wasn't like Tommy said, "Hey, we want you to master these replacements reissues." What happened was I had mixed and mastered the Bash and Pop record, and it was what it was. Somewhere in there, I had remastered the first Bash and Pop album with some bonus tracks, which you could only get on CD from Omnivore Records. They didn't get the license to put it up on streaming. So if you're
Really?
a Bash and Pop fan, I think the only way to get the bonus disc is an actual CD purchase from Omnivore. It's not on streaming yet.
Oh, really?
Anyways, I did a deluxe edition of the first Bash and Pop record. And I remember it kind of coming up in conversation casually, but this is when they were getting ready to put out Live at Maxwell's. And at one point, Tommy asked me if I would mix Live at Maxwell's. And I was kind of hoping I didn't have to, because I didn't have time at that point in time for anything. Then it turns out that they found a good mix of it that someone had done in the 2000s, and they were going to work from that. But I didn't know any of this stuff really, and I didn't even really want to get involved with that because I was pretty busy touring and doing my other work. I just kind of let it. I didn't push too hard to do the mastering on Maxwell's, but it turned out that there was some things that certain people weren't happy with the mastering. Not so much with the band, but some online comments and this and that. I still think it's a great sounding live album.
Well, it
And it's
really is.
amazing that they found it. If you really dig into the weeds, there were some technical things that prompted Bob Mayer to reach out to me to master what would be the next project, which is Dead Man's Pop. So that was my first actual replacements project, was Dead Man's Pop. And again, it wasn't like Tommy said, "Hey, Justin needs to master this." It was just he trusted me to do his records, and it just kind of worked out naturally. Where they realized maybe for these reissues they need to hire someone that's a little closer to the band, that kind of understands the band, and is going to put in the extra 10% to make sure that it's as good as it can be, instead of it just being another day job, another job, and move on. Because mastering is so fast paced. I mean, a live album might take 2 days, but your typical studio album, you can master an album in a day. The box sets take a little longer because there's so many songs. Like the Sorry Ma box set was 100 songs. It's actually 104 songs. I think we took 4 of them off, or they're only available on like a Flexi 7-inch or something.
I
But
know the one you're talking about. Yeah.
the box sets take a long time because A, there's so many songs, and B, usually the demos and outtakes are like challenging sources. It's like old tapes with a lot of dropouts that need a lot of restoration work. And they just all sound so different. So the box sets take a while, but yeah, for the most part, I forgot even what I was talking about, but basically I kind of earned Bob's trust through doing Tommy's Bash and Pop record and some other things. And so I started out with Dead Man's Pop, and that seemed to go well, and I've been doing them ever since. And as you mentioned, the new Tim remix just got announced last week.
Yes. Very much
And
looking forward to that.
it's I think most people are liking it. I've been reading a little bit of the comments. There's always the people that are going to be attached to the original mix because of that's how they remember it. They've been listening to it for decades now. It's got some romance and nostalgia to it, but I do think, from a technical standpoint, the new mixes are just night and day difference. And even, some people were wondering, Left of the Dial was actually done in a different session that I believe Alex Chilton produced than the rest of the record. So people are wondering if the weird drum sounds that Tommy and Ramon got are baked into the recording. And I would say for the most part, they're not. I mean, the whole record basically sounds like a whole new record. The drums sound good and normal, and it overall just has so much more power and beef, and a lot less reverb.
That's not a bad thing. Less reverb.
Yeah, I mean, not to get too far into it, I mean, there could have been maybe a happy medium in between where it's all personal taste at this point. But I mean, this gives you a much more better idea of what the band sounded like at the time. Similar to Maxwell's. It's such a raw Live at Maxwell's is such a raw recording in a good way. It's just pure. It's just like, here's the band. You can hear one guitar on the left and one on the right, and it's very just bare bones, and and that's why it's great. And all the new, not just Left of the Dial, but all the new remixes sound really good. I mean, the sounds were all there. It just got, I don't know what happened in mixing, but what didn't help is the first digital mastering made it even worse. Because I also remastered the main mixes for disc 2, and there's a lot more low end there than I expected there to be on the actual mixes. Something
Really?
super, when Pleased to Meet Me and Tim first came out on CDs were such a new thing that the mastering, I don't want to say it got screwed up, but it just the technology was so primitive. There was no standards. It just sounded really thin and bright and weird, and uh, wasn't as good as it could be. And it also wasn't necessarily representative of what it sounded like in the studio at the time. I think they were still ironing out how to get audio on CDs and have it sound good.
I mean, it's almost like you were talking about earlier with like, recording the obsoletes to tape instead of not wanting to go all digital back in the day. Because it's the same thing. I feel like in the early 2000s, Pro Tools and all that, there's still all this. You're still learning about it. Like there's all these kinks still. It's not perfect, and it's kind of the same thing. A lot of that new technology in the 80s, those are some of the first albums to really be using some of that stuff. So all the kinks and all the things that can go wrong probably going to go wrong during that.
Yeah, because I was comparing what I was doing to I bought an original CD on Discogs. I got a pretty early version from Rhino and Warner's from their vault, and then I compared it to the 2008 remaster, which some people think was too bass heavy. So I just wanted to find a happy medium, but to my surprise, the actual mixes weren't as weird as most people think they are, because of that. The first CD mastering just got kind of botched, or something. Something was weird about it. So I'm not saying the remaster sounds night and day different, but it might be like afternoon and night different, if you know what I mean, or somewhere in between. So I'm curious to see the reaction to the remaster of the, disc 2 is the remaster of the original mixes. Disc 1 is all Ed's new mixes, and Ed did an amazing job, not just mixing it, but piecing it all together, because with analog tape, it's not like you're opening a Pro Tools session and it's exactly how they left it. Ed had to go through and do some detective work, and it's like, okay, there's 3 tracks of vocals, like which was the final vocal take, and did they use any bits from a different track for certain lines? Like Replacements fans are going to notice that, like if there's one word or one line that's different, that's Replacements fans are going to notice that. So he had to and same with guitar parts. There was probably some songs that had a whole mess of extra, lead guitars, this and that, and he had to go through and say, okay, this got used on the original album, this didn't get used. They used a little chunk. It's not like opening a Pro Tool session and everything is where you left it. With analog tape, there could be tons of stuff on that tape that didn't get used, and there could be certain tracks that only got used for part of the song. And and that's what I was talking about with mixing the Obsoletes record, is you had to do that all by hand. When the tape played, you had to move stuff or mute stuff or turn stuff, all that stuff was done by hand. And consoles became automated to some degree over the decades, but for the most part, it was a very hands-on operation. And if you pull out that reel of tape decades later, there's some detective work that has to go on to make sure you have all the right vocal takes and the right lead takes, and just going through it all to figure out what's what, because it's not like you just put on the reel of tape and everything's magically perfectly there, just as you're not starting from where the other mix left off. You're basically, it's like if they recorded the record and the first mix was a puzzle, you're basically putting all the pieces of the puzzle back in the box, and Ed had to put the puzzle back together again to make it what it is. Aside from sounding good, just getting the right parts in place to be the mix again was a job in itself. So he did an awesome job, and I really liked listening to it, and I think other people will too. I think the new mix was unexpected and kind of jarring, but I think when people hear the whole record in context with this new mix, it's going to be like a whole new record to some people. And I'm even getting messages from younger people that, younger than me, that never really listened to the Replacements much. They've only heard of the Replacements, and they just really are liking the new mix because it sounds a little more like
Way
something that
more full.
something they can relate to instead of just this weird tinny reverby kind of thing, which I understand has its charm. And the Replacements were a flawed band, so to have a flawed mix fits the motif in a lot of ways. But similar to the Beatles remix, I'm a fairly big Beatles fan, and their albums have been getting remixed. It's a political topic as well. Even if you don't love the new mix and you prefer the old mix, a lot of times the new mixes help you hear things you didn't realize were there. Or there's people even saying they're hearing lyrics, they're actually understanding the lyrics more on this new mix. They didn't realize he was saying this, they thought it was something else, and stuff like that. So even if you don't end up preferring the new mix, I think it helps you appreciate the old mix when you listen back to it again, because now you can hear better what they were doing, and you still have that old mix to listen to, but now you can know what's going on a little more.
No, I mean, the old album never goes away. That's why I don't get with people who do who get that way, where it's like, oh, I want it to be like it, like it's been for 30 years. Like, it's not like that goes away. You can still very much go listen to the old
Yeah.
version. It
Yeah,
doesn't disappear.
it's still there. And I think even more so than Don't Tell a Soul, I think the majority of Replacements fans have been wanting this album to be remixed for a long time. So that wish is fulfilled. The old version is still there. And I also feel like the majority of comments I've seen are people that really like the new mix. And again, this is just one song, and it was an interesting choice. It wasn't the song I would have picked to do first, but I don't work at a record label. But again, Left of the Dial was apparently an Alex Chilton produced song, or at least session. So it's kind of the oddball. It's kind of the odd man out of the album. It's the same take. I'm not saying it's a different version than the old album. Even on the old record, that song was from a different session. So it is more or less live with the addition of Alex's backing vocals, whereas the rest of the album that has a few more overdubs and was more produced, those new mixes just sound great. And my favorite, I don't want to say my favorite, but if I could listen to any song off of it right now, because I've taken a little break from it. I did most of this work at the end of last year and very early 2023. So I have not heard it in a while.
You've been removed for a while. You could remove yourself from it for a while.
Yeah, I've had some distance from it. There's a song called "Having Fun" that Tommy Stinson wrote, and to me, that's the standout track of at least the bonus tracks. And I don't know how much you've listened to like the "Pleased to Meet Me" set, but some of his tracks.
I loved them. It was so rad to hear these uncovered. Like before that, you had like Satellite, and all of a sudden they're like uncovering all these Tommy sang songs. I love them. Those are some of the best parts of the "Pleased to Meet Me" box set.
Same here. And Tim doesn't have that, but what it has is a song that he wrote. I didn't hear it, but apparently there's a vocal take of Tommy trying to sing it, and he's pretty young at the time still, and it just didn't get used. And then Paul did a couple vocal takes, and Ed remixed that song, and somehow that song's never been bootlegged. And I could be wrong, but Bob, according to Bob Mayer and Jason at Rhino, and we can't really find any evidence of that song being bootlegged before or released. So it's kind of a cool, in my opinion, it's going to be like Replacements fans hearing a brand new song that's never even been bootlegged, that would very easily be in my opinion, one of the better songs on Tim. It has a hint of Husker Du in it too. It's like in my opinion, if they would have put it on the record, it would be way above, like Dose of Thunder and Lay It Down Clown get a lot of flack for being throwaways. So if that's your barometer, I think way above those two songs. Not quite like a Nowhere Is My Home track, but it would have been a great song on the record. For some reason, it just got shelved and never got used. So not only is it, a great song, but it's going to be like uncovering a time capsule here for people to hear that song. And Yeah, especially the chorus just gives me kind of a Husker Du kind of vibe with some cool. You'll hear it eventually, but that to me that's the one of the more exciting bonus tracks, and it never really occurred to me, but "Nowhere Is My Home" is such a highly regarded song. The mix on that it was super weird. It's never really had a great, well done mix, and it didn't have the same problems that Tim had, but it had different technical problems, and so to finally have a really solid mix of "Nowhere Is My Home," I think people are going to be happy about too.
Oh, it's one of my favorite replacement songs. I can't wait to hear that. With I mean, because again, like these box sets, I mean, people listening to this are probably big replacements fans. Oh, you know it, but like those box sets are full of like rarities and unreleased stuff. I mean, when they put these together, I mean, is this we hearing pretty much everything from the sessions and vaults, or I mean, is there still stuff they're not putting on these box sets? You know what I mean? Because like you're talking about Sorry Ma, you look at all the tracks on that, it's like, I mean, is there anything even left at that point?
I would say for for Sorry Ma, probably not. I have to look through my emails and my archives. I feel like there was one song on the "Please to Meet Me" set that got sort of vetoed at the last minute, and it might have been one of Tommy's songs. And I think it's been bootlegged, but this would have been a really good resolution way to hear this particular Tommy song that I think got vetoed at the near the last minute for whatever reason. Um, Maybe just didn't want it out there, but I think you're hearing probably 99% of it. I feel like if in 20 more years, if they start doing these reissues again, I don't think you're going to get anything new. Um, I don't think you're getting any. I think this is I don't want to say bottom of the barrel, but you're getting everything. I think at that point they could maybe do a unreleased compilation of maybe 10, 12 songs, but I don't think you're going to get even more expanded editions. This is pretty much everything that's going to, there's stuff that came out on Sorry Ma that got vetoed the first time around by Paul. And I don't think the record label wanted to do such an expansive, I don't think Rhino wanted to do such an expansive version in 2008. They just didn't think there was the market for it. But starting with Bob's book, he did all this research and discovered all these tapes. He sort of discovered Maxwell's and that it could be a live album, and that sort of proved to Rhino, I think, that there is a market, there's an appetite and a market for this stuff, and that they can do these expanded sets. So yeah, I mean, I guess I can't speak for every album, but for the albums we've done, that's basically everything. Everything and a little more probably. That I don't think there's any big secret. People were worried about the Tim set and trying to fill that up, but the bonus disc filled up, pretty nicely actually. Especially again with having fun being sort of in my opinion, the highlight of it. Just because of it's never been heard. It'd be like going back in time and hearing a new Replacement song.
Nice.
You can't do that. You can't really. There's not many chances to do that, but this is one of those chances, and it's a very strong song. So,
I mean, again, like it's so crazy to think for the longest time. I mean, up until like that Please to Meet Me one. I mean, besides like Satellite and maybe one other bootleg, things like that. Like who knew Tommy had so many songs that even they get released, like that he sang on and stuff. Like so many of these things just, and I mean, over the years, there's been lots of bootlegs and expanded stuff come out, but the fact that more is just, I don't know, it blows my mind. It makes me happy as a fan to find it all as well, or, for them to kind of discover all of that. Cause yeah, I mean, it's like anything and everything. You get 5 different versions of the same song, but I like that. I like going through and, kind of hearing them all. But I want to ask you, cause we kind of talked about it a little bit, but I mean, going back, remastering, working on something that has existed for decades. I mean, you're going to get people, which I love the mix of Left of the Dial. I'm kind of like, if you're not married to that original one, if you just play someone off the street that today, they'll have no problems with it. It's just somebody who's listened to the same mix for 30 years or whatever. But for you, for the mastering side, like I was kind of interested in this. You remastering something versus you mastering new music, because obviously you do both. Is it more difficult to remaster something in the sense that you are going back to something that did have a foundation that people have heard a certain way versus you go master a new album, you're setting that foundation. I mean, is there any more difficulty to remastering versus mastering something new?
The difficulty can be kind of in the detective work again, like just simple things as recreating the song transitions, like two songs crossfade together or something. Um, you also have to be careful. A lot of remasters get a bad rap because they get mastered too loud. I mean, a lot of records from the early 90s and earlier, so I'm talking like anything between the 60s and early 90s, you know, there was no such thing as digital limiting to squash the waveform. Um, so a lot of times remasters get a bad rap because it's classic music that you're used to hearing a certain way with dynamics and breathing room, and then they get crushed with a digital limiter, and they sound a little harsh and unnatural and things like that. So I'm very careful to not over squash things if it's from the early 90s or older, because I don't want to get those complaints about being you know over compressed, over limited, stuff like that. So it's not necessarily challenging. It's just you got to be very careful to respect the music. And a lot of maybe not the replacements, but some of the other remasters I've done. I mean, I've done records that were extremely well produced and then mastered by like Bernie Grundman, who is one of the greatest mastering engineers of all time, and he's been doing it for a long time. And he's one of the grandfathers of mastering. So I mean, how are you going to beat that? Your job is to be very delicate and do as little as possible. But at the same time, even the greats like Bernie Grundman, they were using maybe not at the time, the digital tools were pretty terrible compared to what we have now. So, you might have had a great engineer working on it, but he might have not had the best digital tools compared to what we have now. So there's usually improvements that can be made, but sometimes you got to just tread very lightly and not change too much. And not to get into a big discussion, but with mastering, we're not changing the levels of instruments or reverbs, or we're just adjusting the overall loudness and EQ of the whole song or whole album. I can't go in and turn the drums up or down. I can't remove the 80s drum reverb in mastering. It's all baked in. Um, so, and Pleased to Meet Me had some challenges because Paul has a very sibilant voice, and Pleased to Meet Me was one of the first all digital recordings, from my understanding. Ardent had just put in a digital multi-track recorder. So instead of doing it on 2-inch analog tape, it was a digital system. And analog tape can kind of absorb, you can kind of overload the tape and it kind of breaks up and saturates cool, and it can absorb some of the high frequencies and give it a warmer, softer tone. Well, digital is not forgiving. Even and back then it was actually kind of harsh sounding. So a lot of the S sounds on the first Pleased to Meet Me are super loud. If you listen to the original master, anytime there's an S, it's just like as loud as the whole band. And that's just not natural to my ears. So I went through, and every time there was an S, I used a program that's basically like Photoshop for audio. I didn't just put a de-esser on the whole mix, because that's going to impact the cymbals and the acoustic guitars and anything with the high frequency. I had to listen in real time, and when there was an S, I could circle the S with the lasso tool and then just dim it a little bit. I'm not removing the S, but just making it a little less brittle, because it was a digital recording and going into digital reverb, and it just got a little too harsh, in my opinion, for my ears. So my goal there was, and I also got more, like I said, with some remasters, it's like do as little as possible because it's already amazing. I got a little more direction from Luther Dickinson, which is Jim Dickinson's son, about trying to make it a little warmer in the low mids. I hate to use that word warmer and talk about too much technical stuff, but he just thought it was, apparently his dad never cared for the CD master of Pleased to Meet Me, and just wanted it to be a little more pleasing to the ears, a little more warmth in the low mids, feel the bass a little more, and not have the high end be so brittle. So I probably shifted that more than I would have without any direction, because it's not really for me to say exactly how if something's been established, like Pleased to Meet Me, it's not my, who am I to say it's all wrong, but they gave me specific instructions of, maybe what their dad wanted to hear. And you know, because again, CDs were new at that time. So he just apparently thought the CD was a little brittle and bright and harsh. So I took I did bigger changes on that one as opposed to like other remasters, like the, uh, why am I drawing a blank? Friday Night is Killing Me. That was done in the early to mid, 92, 93, but that was a pretty loud record. That's when they finally had digital limiting to make stuff super loud and stuff like that. So anyways, it's a little bit of a, always mastering is always a tread lightly situation. Even new albums, it's like I assume that people love what they send me. They've done their best work, and it's my job to just get it over the finish line. Um, you know, I don't set out trying to change it a lot. I try to do as little as possible to get it where it needs to be.
No, that's all really interesting. It does. I think for people listening too, who again maybe blur the lines of production and engineering and mixing and mastering and all that, kind of telling what the differences actually are and kind of what you're doing when you go in there and master and remaster. It's kind of interesting actually. It is very interesting, kind of like hearing that stuff. But
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I know. Yeah, I mean, people don't always know the difference between mixing and mastering, and I don't expect them to. But mastering it can be important, but it's not like, well, the Ed Stasium remix is a great example of how to make it almost opposite of what it was. That's what you can do in mixing. There's no way the best mastering engineer in the world could never take the original Tim mixes and transform it into that. It's not even possible.
it's not a thing you can do.
The best you're going to hear is comparing, disc 2 of the new set to, what you remember of the digital version of Tim, and see what you think there.
I mean, at this point, is it safe to say that, I mean, are they trying to do you think every replacements record is going to get this treatment? I mean, is that kind of where we're going, all the full lengths and maybe even Stink for good measure?
Yeah, I think they'll hit them all eventually. I know they're going in no particular order. Um, I think, All Shook Down is a good one because there's probably a lot of, Paul has a lot of home demos of that record.
Oh yeah.
And the obvious live show is their original last show in Chicago that I've heard that there's a good multi-track recording of that could be, the broadcast mix is pretty good already, but
It goes out somewhere though, right? Because I have a bootleg of that and it's good, but somewhere in the broadcast, I
yeah,
think it kind of loses. I can't remember entirely, but it loses a little something.
yeah. So I think, the All Shook Down, I would imagine for sure will get, and I haven't started on any new one. I don't know what they're thinking next. I'm just throwing out, I know All Shook Down would have a lot of bonus material and a great live show to go with it. Um, Let It Be, there seems to be a lot of outtakes and stuff like that for Let It Be. Um, Stink was apparently done in a day basically, so
Oh,
probably not
wow.
a lot of outtakes. So I mean, definitely turned a corner with this one, but I think there's still more in there. It's just I don't think it's been decided which one to tackle next.
I was wondering that if they had a thought process of, because you're right. I mean, it's not like it's not like they started at Sorry Ma and started working their way. I mean, just start with Dead Man's Pop and then kind of work all around. So yeah, I was wondering that if they had a rhyme or reason to that, or it was just kind of like, I don't know, maybe they unearthed this. So this year they're doing this one and next year they'll do this one.
No, I mean I think Sorry Ma was chosen because it was a 40th anniversary that worked out
That's right.
well. That's a nice even number. Pleased to Meet Me was tough because we did that early in COVID. I mean, I remember when COVID hit, nobody knew what was going on. And I'm like, man, if bands can't record, how am I going to keep mastering their music and stuff like that? And it ended up being fine. But early on in COVID is when they first approached me to do, I got an email from Jason saying, we're going to do Pleased to Meet Me next. And here's some stuff. And I'm like, okay, that was a huge relief to get that email because those projects are a little more involved than like your typical new album. But it was a little bit hard, I think, to get sources because a lot of this stuff is in the vault. And like early on in COVID, people weren't leaving their houses, and if they could see that we had, there was a tape that existed, but it hasn't been digitized yet, it was a little harder to get, like, some of the vault materials transferred, and it wasn't, we still made a good box set out of it, but I remember COVID being a slight, not a big hampering, but it was definitely a factor of like, okay, COVID's not going to be a good one time to do something that involves a lot of tape transferring, and they kind of needed something that was already in the can, so to speak. But now that we're out of COVID, anything's possible. As far as digging up sources, if anything needs to be transferred and stuff like that, we're pretty much back to normal. But yeah, I would say the Hillmom. I mean, maybe who knows? Peter Jesperson has such a collection of live recordings. It's possible that he has a good live show from that era. I have no idea what's next, to be honest with you. We're just kind of catching our breath from finishing this one up, because so much goes into it behind the scenes. I mean, I just do the audio, but I mean, Bob and Jason are doing the liner notes, the marketing, all that stuff. It's a lot of work to do these reissues.
I mean, credit to everybody who puts them together, because it is like the fact that it's called Let It Bleed. I mean, you can tell people care when they put these out. They're not thrown together. It's kind of if you're a Replacements fan, you're like, oh, like the references in there, all the different things you get. It seems like it's lovingly put together, not like you were talking about, like even getting you in the mix, where they didn't just go, well, shit, Replacements records sell right now, let's just throw something together. It seems like there really is time and effort put into these things.
Definitely. I mean, Bob and Jason have been incredible, just digging up stuff and coming up with ideas. And, it just helps so much that Bob wrote that book, because he just ended up digging up so much stuff, finding tapes, or realizing that they did a session here and where are those tapes, and finding live shows, and putting all the pieces together. It really opened a can of worms of stuff. And I think one of Jason from Rhino's first project was either Maxwell's or Dead Man's Pop. He's was somewhat new to Rhino at the time, and got the green light to, let's try and do these. And as long as people keep having interest in them, it seems like there'll be a budget to put them together. So, but it is a lot. And one of the great things about the collections are Bob's liner notes and the photos they come up with. So, I mean, if you're a fan of Replacements, or any of these bands that are getting the deluxe treatments, I mean, the booklets and the pictures are just something you can't get online. And I think it's just fun to have an actual physical copy of the stuff, even if you never played the CDs, just to get the booklet and all the pictures and stuff is really cool.
Nice. No, I mean, I'm excited, as I'm sure everyone else is, to hear the new box set. Just a couple more for you here. We'll start closing this out, but I did have a couple people send me listener questions who wanted to ask some stuff, and we had a couple good ones actually. So I wanted to ask you them. We had one from Peter K, which I liked. What song off Tim do you think benefits the most from the remaster? I like that when you're like listening to it. Is there one you think like, oh wow, that one really benefited the most from it?
From the remix or the remaster? The remix, probably. Ooh, right?
Good point. Yeah. Remix. He was asking.
Okay. I really like I'll Buy from the remixes, because that's one where I think Ed kind of had to throw in some of the reverb and effects, because the vocal has such a distinct slapback kind of delay. And there's some parts where it stops and it's just vocals basically. And if it was totally dry, it would just sound weird. So Ed did a good job of bringing in some effects when it was needed. So I'll Buy is good. Here Comes a Regular is so different now in a good way. Everything's just, it sounds like Paul sitting in your living room playing the song for you. It's just so intimate, it's just like everything's dry and nicely recorded. It's, in a way, it's hard to believe it's the same recording. Here Comes the Regular. And I think I think Waitress in the Sky is one that stands out too, because it just has a little more beef to it. You know, they all do, but um, it just, yeah. So probably those three. I mean, it's hard to pick a favorite, but those couple are my standout. You know, the ones that really benefited. And then I will say that Swingin'. I'm not saying it's my favorite, or I'm not saying it's not, but Swingin' Party is another one where they really um, reverted back to like a lot of reverb on the vocals, and it you know, it's not as dry and sounding as some of the other remixes. You know, so they did with a slower song like that. I think they realized it's better to keep some of the bigger reverb sounds on it.
Nice, nice. I one from Richard Datson. He was asking if anything surprised you that you came across while remastering it. Probably like some of the whether it is a something in the track you never heard before, or you know something you were kind of surprised by.
Yeah, I'll say in general. I mean, you can understand lyrics better in the new mixes. Um, I'm really happy with the remaster of the old mixes too. I think Dose of Thunder. Say what you will about the songwriting itself and stuff, but I feel like the remaster on disc 2 of Dose of Thunder is a little more under control, and part of that might be because I had computer technology to help rein it in instead of just relying on, you know, analog technology. It just needed a little. Dose of Thunder needed a lot more repair, like almost repair work or restoration work to that mix. So it's weird. Right away, I think Dose of Thunder just kicks in harder, and it's just a little more under control in a good way. Because I mean, it's supposed to be a out of control rocker kind of
It's
song, but
noisy. That opening is noisy. I know what you're talking
yeah,
about. It's
yeah.
very noisy.
And a Little Mascara. That's another probably standout remix. There's some really cool Bob guitar leads at the end of that song that either were buried or not used in the original mix, and a very cool scream from Westerberg at the end of Little Mascara. So Little Mascara gets pretty epic at the end on the new mix.
Nice, nice. Well, I mean, beyond the new Tim box set, any other projects you're currently working on? Anything else going on in the world of Mystery Room mastering you can talk about?
Well, I'm always working on stuff. That's the thing. Like mastering, like I said, I mean, I'm doing like a record a day probably, or,
Jeez.
or you know, a bunch of singles in the EP. Lydia Lovelace has been rolling out a new album on Bloodshot Records. I think there's 2 singles out now, and I really enjoyed working on her album. Um, Lydia actually played it when I was playing with Bash and Pop. We played in Ohio, and she sang "Anybody Else" with us, the Bash and Pop song. I think it was in Columbus. But I didn't really meet her. Like she just came up on stage and sang it, and then that was it. But um, some people, this guy Sean Sullivan from Nashville. I'm not sure if he fully produced it, but he basically produced it with Lydia and mixed it, and he did a great job. It's more of a rock album than a country album, in my opinion. Um, so it's a more rocking album for Bloodshot Records, but her album's pretty good. I don't know. You caught me off guard, so I'd have to look at my calendar. But you know, she's that album's kind of stands out, and I don't know what else. I'd have to look at my
You're
thing,
working
but
on a lot, man. That's a good sign you don't know because it means you're working on a lot of things.
yeah, I mean, I do a lot of remastering for Universal and a little bit for Rhino. And if you're really interested, you can always check my Instagram. I try to post some of the highlights on Instagram. In fact, I'm going to just take a quick peek at it right now and see if anything pops out that I'm totally spacing on, but probably not.
Yeah, that will be the thing, though. You won't think of anything now, and like 20 minutes after this interview, like 30 different things you're working on will pop in your head.
Yeah, I mean, I've in the last year or so, I've done solo albums for both of the, I shouldn't say both, Mike and Pete from the Figs, and the latest Figs album, and they're one of my favorite bands, the Figs, and they're actually playing here in Madison this week. So I'm looking forward to getting out of the studio and hearing music in real life for a little bit here.
Do you? I know we talked about how you don't, road dogging and touring a lot's not really a thing you're interested in, but Do you ever miss the fronting of a band? Like I know with Tommy, you were kind of doing a little more of the side thing. I mean, do you ever miss doing kind of more like the Obsoletes thing, or is that's not even anything you really even think about anymore?
No, it was fun when I was younger and could stay up late and had the energy for that, but I'm a pretty quiet, even though I've been talking for almost a little over an hour now. I'm a fairly quiet person, fairly introverted. I don't need a lot of social like interaction, or I don't need a lot of social reinforcement of like, hey, you did great. I started playing in bands when we were in like sixth grade just for something to do because I wasn't really into sports. Well, I was, but I was not. I knew I wasn't good at sports and wasn't like into normal stuff. So my friends and I just started doing bands just for fun, just for something to do. And we were at a young enough age where no one else was really doing it in our peer group, so we would get to play at the YMCA or the local show. If the local show needed an opener, we would get the phone call to do that and stuff like that. So we just got into it at such a young age just for something to do, but it was never like an attention thing or seeking validation. It was just something fun to goof around with friends that turned into something that we had a little bit of success with. But I don't miss it at all. Like I said, if Tommy or someone wanted to do a weekend of shows, I would consider playing it, but no desire to be in an active band again or any of that stuff. I mean, if I got to a point where I could retire early from mastering, it might be fun to do a band again or something, but I just can't do both. Just from, yeah, I mean, luckily I got earplugs about when I was in my early to mid 20s, which I think I was just in time before I was doing any serious damage. I mean, I'm sure I did a little bit of damage, but getting earplugs probably was the smartest thing I ever did because it allowed me to have a career in mixing and mastering and stuff. Because if I would have just never gotten earplugs, my ears would be destroyed by now. So
You,
anyway, that was a long answer, but no desire. I would fill in on bass if someone needed it, if it was the right situation, but for the most part, no. I don't. My bass, a friend of mine has my bass. He needed it for something, and um, I don't have a desire to even have it in the house right now. So
yeah, I mean, you do good at mastering, so I mean, I think you're in quite a good lane. I think
yeah,
that,
it
like,
keeps me very busy. I mean, I mostly listen to podcasts or nothing when I'm out of the studio. It's sad, but reality of working in music is when you're working on music all day, you just it's not as your brain and ears just can't handle more music. Occasionally, I can put on some background jazz or something without vocals, but I don't get to listen to music for fun as much anymore, which is a little bit sad, but the cool part is I get to listen to music all day for a living, so I'm not complaining whatsoever. But the idea of working in the studio and then going to a band practice or whatever is not
no.
interesting to me whatsoever.
No, I mean, on top of doing this, I work at radio, and the last thing I want to do at the end of the day is listen to anyone else doing interviews or podcasts. I totally understand 100% where you're coming from. Eventually, when you're doing it all day, the fun thing isn't getting away from work by doing more work, basically.
Yeah, but I had fun when I was younger. I'm glad I got into it, and it all led to a lot of cool things. But I'm I'm definitely pretty much over it.
Well, man, I will tell you, the second the Obsoletes do a reunion tour, I'm there. I'm following it
Yeah.
all across the country.
I mean, I wouldn't rule out the fact that we could do a reunion show at some point
Why not?
somewhere. But yeah, like I said, I would have to have a nice break from mastering and working in the studio before I have the bandwidth to make a bunch of racket
Understandable.
w-
No,
in a room.
no, Justin. I mean, this has been a blast talking to you. Love to have you back sometime. But I mean, as we close this out, you want to tell people again where we can find you online, Mystery Room Mastering. I mean, who knows? Maybe somebody's even people are out there looking for a mastering job. I mean, where can we find you online for all this stuff?
Well, mysteryroommastering.com is the main website. It has links to all the social media places I'm active, like Instagram and Twitter LinkedIn. So right on that front page, you can click on any of those icons and see what I'm up to. I have a link tree that I don't have memorized, but maybe you can put it in the show notes or wherever. But that also goes to all the websites and some other interviews I've done. And, I've written articles about mastering. The mastering website has a page to see how much things cost, and you can even submit your project right on that page without even having to get a hold of me. I mean, it'll come right to me, but you can get, that's kind of it was designed that way because with mastering, I'm always asking the same questions, like, what's your band name? What's the album name? What's the song order? So we made it into a form where people can just submit the project right on the website. And that kind of cuts down on the back and forth. And I can spend more time on the music and less time on the emailing. But anyways, mysteryremastering.com is a great hub, as well as the link tree. And if anyone wants to email me about mastering, feel free to do that and get in touch.
Nice. No, Justin, great talking to you. Again, I mean, if you're listening to this before September 22nd, you got Tim Let It Bleed edition coming out the 22nd of September on Rhino Records. And if you're listening to the radio show, probably going to play tons and tons of replacements now. We still got an hour and a half, so lots of mats to fit in there. But I'm Anthony Merchant talking to Justin Perkins right here on the Power Chord Hour.